If you were to give me a character that even the game's history misunderstands, the serpent god Orobashi would be the first one on my list, portrayed as an ancient serpent that dare bare its fangs against the Narukami Ogosho. But from a lore perspective, despite Orobashi and the Tatarigami being portrayed as this malevolent entity that would whisper to his followers' ears to sacrifice the lives of the innocent, Orobashi as a god is a much sadder tale than what the people of Inazuma would like you to believe. So with that, welcome to the misunderstood god of Inazuma, Orobashi, where I will be showing the magnificent but sad tale and legacy of the Watatsumi Omikami. Let's begin with an overview of who Orobashi is and what are his out of Genshin inspirations. Orobashi is the god of Watatsumi that was responsible for helping the people of Enkanomiya, or the people of the dark abyssal sea, to rise up to the surface. He was first introduced in 2.0 and was a central plot point for the world quest Orobashi's Legacy. Orobashi is the god of Watatsumi prior his death by Raiden A's hand during the Archon War. He was an unintentionally massive part of Inazuma's portion of the Archon War, which means that he most likely has a counterpart in the Ars Goetia, the source material for the names of the Archons and other gods that contributed heavily to the Archon War. Orobas is a powerful great prince of hell, and supposedly gives true answers of things past, present, and to come, divinity, and the creation of the world. He also confers dignities and prelacies, and the favor of friends and foes. Orobas is faithful to the conjurer, does not permit that any spirit tempts him, and never deceives anyone. This is going to be an important context when we begin piecing together his story. As for Orobashi's counterpart in Japanese mythology, one of the most influential pieces that has been referenced in modern media time and time again is the tale of Yamata no Orochi, the ancient eight-headed and eight-tailed serpent that was slain by the Shinto storm god Susanoo with the sword Kusanagi no Tsurugi, or the grass-cutting sword. I also do want to preface that in the context of Genshin, Orobashi is not the same as the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros is also another symbol that is depicted as a serpent shaped in a circle that's eating its own tail, a symbol of rebirth and the cyclical implications of reincarnation. The Ouroboros in Genshin actually predates Orobashi, and we'll probably get to that in another video. But just in point, Orobashi is not the same as Ouroboros in the context of Genshin. Now continuing with Orobashi, despite being depicted as this massive monster responsible for the deaths and illnesses of many, the god is actually not a malevolent being intent on taking revenge. No, quite the contrary. Orobashi was a benevolent and empathetic god that simply couldn't live to the standards and harsh realities that the world threw at him at the time. He was a victim of circumstance and the intricacies of divine law, but he nevertheless tried to keep his people despite everything. He wanted to look after the people who were abandoned just as he was abandoned himself. And that tale begins with his backstory. The pre-Enkanomiya tale of Orobashi begins with the slow uprising of the Archon War, in which Orobashi flees to the Dark Sea for two reasons. We know that the Archon War was a test of might and power for the sake of rulership of one of the seven nations. As a god, Orobashi found himself unable to best both the Golden God and the Narukami. As a result, Orobashi lost everything as he fled to the Dark Sea. He quotes, "I am the profane serpent. Though my servants are numberless, not one mortal now dwells in my shadow. That I have fallen into this realm, and that we would meet. Perhaps this is fate. You are not one of my people, but you are human nonetheless. Speak your desire, and I shall hear it." He says in the Oathsworn Eye that he was being shamed for blasphemy. This blasphemy is currently unknown at the moment, but this is most likely because it was against the law of Celestia to actively leave the Archon War, even more so to dive into the deep sea, which was considered a land beyond the jurisdiction of Celestia. We'll return to that point later on what that blasphemy could be. Now we continue the tale of his slow rise as the god who saved the people of Watatsumi. He was found one day when the people were still being terrorized by the bishops. A child found him slumbering and asked if he could help end the era of the Sun Children, the old ruling authority of the people of Enkanomiya. Orobashi agreed, and thus started a new era. According to the Oathsworn Weapon, Orobashi never wanted to rule the people of Enkanomiya, and even tried to convince them that he was not worthy of being their deity. He even respected that if the people of Enkanomiya believed they wished to be godless, he would honor that request. But the people of Enkanomiya and Orobashi eventually had a pact together, and Orobashi became their deity for years to come. What is fascinating about this pact is that it's mentioned that Orobashi also has a pact with the Heavenly City, something we'll actually get back to later, but now we move on to his role as the Watatsumi Ogosho. Orobashi actually had a lot of contributions to the endeavors of Watatsumi's people, and was a very active member of their development. During the time his people were still in Enkanomiya, Orobashi actually spearheaded the research into the bishops, and most of the works in the Byakuya-koku collection had him as a collaborator. He was also giving special orders as evidenced by the records called Void 907, Watatsumi Omikami's Special Orders 1 and 3. As for his saving of the people of Enkanomiya, the island of Watatsumi and its people were formally created about 2,000 years ago. They broke off corals from Orobashi's body and created a ladder to the surface world. Furthermore, the actual island of Watatsumi was made from the coral branches that were broken off from Orobashi's body. It is said that during this time, the great serpent Orobashi broke the coral branches and guided the people of the Dark Sea back to the light of day, and by his grace and pity, he gathered them together to make a living upon the barren island of coral. Watatsumi Island was a product of the Archon War, and thus, when he saved the people, he ultimately completed his initial oath of returning the abandoned people to the surface. But that doesn't mean his job was done. According to Miyazaki Saburo, Orobashi taught them how to smelt and farm. He also taught them how to fish and essentially used their water-based resources to feed themselves. Orobashi also respected the Raiden Shogun's rules and the boundary by the islands, which only makes his next series of actions all the more confusing. Because now we begin the sad downfall of Orobashi. History states that Orobashi actually never wanted to go to Yashiori Island. He was perfectly content with the area of Watatsumi and keeping his territory. As we've said in the beginning, Orobashi was very much aware that he stood no chance against the Narukami Ogosho, to the point he fled from the Archon War. And even when Watatsumi was established, Orobashi respected the boundaries and never crossed the line. So why was there a sudden invasion? Well, according to the preliminary study of Sangonomiya folk belief, the invasion was because of the people's choice, motivated by their needs. Watatsumi Island, while beautiful, was hardly the best place to live in. We have seen in Kokomi's own story quests that the people constantly have problems with food outages and isolated trade routes because of how remote the area is. This problem, however, has been here for several years. The lack of fertile soil made it difficult to grow any kind of crop, and the amount of disease that eventually plagued the land as a result of famine would force the people's hand. Orobashi, as their god, asked the Shrine Maiden one day, "Why do the people of the deep sea weep? Have I not defeated the dragonairs of the depths and gave you the light of day?" The Shrine Maiden would only respond by saying that the land to the east was much more fertile, and asked Orobashi to set foot upon those islands and there carve out a land for the people of Watatsumi. Orobashi, much like the first time when the people of Enkanomiya asked him to be their god, was silent and made no reply. However, because he couldn't bear to see the people suffer, he eventually relented and decided that he would do good on his role as a god and prepare the ultimate sacrifice. He knew there was no hope for victory, and his purpose was not conquest. Orobashi trained the soldiers though, and built a navy led by the Shrine Maiden and her twin sister, and then the rest was the history we know at the moment. But now, let's dive deeper into the strange blanks and questions in his lore that aren't completely explained, and with that, we should start with the in-universe, in-lore theory on the secret of Orobashi's death. You know a game's lore is great when characters are also theorizing. I've mentioned that Orobashi knew that the ordeal was fruitless, and that he and the people around him knew that there was no way he'd be able to best the Raiden Shogun in a battle for conquest. If you read the books about Orobashi, they repeated how vain this task really is. Because, let's face it, if Orobashi himself has already admitted that he is unable to best the Narukami when the war first began, surely there has to be a better way of getting more food for the people of Watatsumi than just immediate conquest. Which is really out of character for a god that has been pretty passive, all things considered. So, what's going on? Well, this was theorized by the author of the preliminary study into Sangonomiya folk belief, summarized by yours truly. According to them, Orobashi's true motives are not well recorded by history. This is merely a hypothesis drawn by those who discovered the inscriptions in latter days. Watatsumi Omikami long knew that he would not have any chance of survival at this time, but accepted the prophecy's result calmly. If he wished to ensure the perpetuation of his people's faith, there was but one path: sacrifice. Even if Watatsumi would pass away, its people would endlessly weave their memories of joy, prosperity, bitterness, and loss into a united fate. These memories, in turn, would flourish on account of the intense emotions of a vanquished people forced into shameless submission. Many among the Watatsumi people now no longer believe that their guiding Omikami has any chance of revival, but their pride as Watatsumi's people, the pain of watching the body of their god carved up for materials by their overlord, the hurt of losing that god. These emotions have passed on from generation to generation, becoming the pillars of forbearance, resistance, and sacrifice that underpin the faith of Watatsumi's people. We should break this down because that's a lot of words. Essentially, the author is suggesting that the real reason Orobashi was able to accept his death peacefully is that if he himself as a god showed himself in a final sacrifice to his people, then he would go down history as a martyr, versus if he were to just die pitifully by doing nothing about the situation of Watatsumi. This does two things. It cements the legacy of Orobashi as, though foolish, a god that was willing to do everything for his people nevertheless despite the odds. The second is that because of Orobashi's sacrifice, the people would continue their fate because of the strong emotions lingering. Loss would invoke feelings of retaliation and retribution, but also build a stronger sense of camaraderie amongst his people. How you would take the implications of a god using their death to fester feelings of both loss and retaliation to uphold a belief system, though, is up for you to decide. Moving on. The book allegedly mentions something called the prophecy, and according to them, Orobashi accepted his calmly, which brings me to the next question. Wasn't he sentenced to death? Now, this is one of the many mysteries in Orobashi's lore that requires a lot of theorizing. There's a really important revelation about Orobashi that doesn't seem to match so well with the rest of his lore, and that's Enjo's description about Orobashi being sentenced to death by Celestia for reading the forbidden book known as the Before Sun and Moon. You know, the book we read. Anyway, at first, I was skeptical of trusting Enjo when he said this the first time, but considering the Flowers of Lost Paradise confirming that Celestia is against civilizations that know too much about the Descenders and the Master of the Four Shades, you can say my doubts are rightfully quelled. Celestia has been quite vehement in silencing information in a really brutal way, but it's actually unknown when he read this book, if it was before or after his meeting of the people of Enkanomiya. The implications of this is that if he read the book before Enkanomiya, his sentence to death was in part of his previous followers suddenly disappearing from history. This would explain his epithet of being the god who lost everything. It could also be possible that as retaliation and for repentance, his oath to Celestia would be to save the people of Enkanomiya. Maybe that's the reason that he is down there in the first place. However, another theory regarding Orobashi's sentence of death is the concept of fate. Him getting that sentence is another way to say that he will inevitably die by the hands of the Narukami Ogosho, regardless of how peaceful his time in Watatsumi could be. If it's true that Orobashi was given a prophecy of death that he accepted, then Celestia's judgment on him was final, and that meant that A and his actions during the Yashiori Island incident were just nothing short of a preordained destiny. Also, according to Aru in the Subterranean Trials of Drake and Serpent, he says that Watatsumi was pronounced guilty of the following sins: 4 counts of the sin of profanity, and a further 8 counts for the sin of deceiving living souls. However, the Watatsumi Omikami is about to carry all the transgressions of Watatsumi and go to its death. Now, there's actually some underlying themes in Orobashi's story, and that it reflects the strange strings being pulled behind the Archon War. Remember how I said that Orobashi already respected the boundaries between the Eastern Islands and Watatsumi? Well, in a perfect world, then that would just be enough. But in the Archon War, there might be some bigger rules at play. The true rules of the Archon War are unknown, but there's something fascinating about the fact that it eventually led to a point where other gods besides the 7 Archons are either dead, sealed, or no longer remember their histories. And going back to Orobashi's lore, I think we can theorize a bunch of the Archon War rules. One was that those who didn't wish to participate are either ostracized or banished. Orobashi himself had to go to exile to escape the Archon War after recognizing the disparity of power between himself and the Narukami. The second one is that eventually, perhaps all of those who lost sort of ceased to exist. According to the preliminary study, in accordance with the law of the Divine Realm, those deities defeated by A were slain. And in the current lore of Genshin, gods are either killed like Havre and the Caribbean, passed on like Andreas, sealed away like Osail, or lost their memories at the point of decommissioning like Marchosius. It's almost like unless you won, you're sort of just not real anymore. Creepy, but fascinating. Now for the last point. It would be really difficult to talk about Orobashi without discussing the legacy of his remnants. The Tatarigami was referred to by Scaramouche as the Wrath of the God, and were known as the remnants of Orobashi, which eventually became such a problem that it was a notable plague across Higi village. So how can a god that we've been saying has been nothing but helpful and benevolent have such a negative legacy to the point that people would hear his voice to sacrifice others? Well, I think that the Tatarigami wasn't inherently his fault. When a god dies, according to Zhongli, their divine power is still beyond mortal comprehension to the point that it could have drastic consequences to the surrounding area if uncontrolled. This was the case with Havria, who was killed. I think this also applies with Orobashi. The lingering effects of the Tatarigami were just remnants of his divine essence, but aren't actually indicative of any intention of Orobashi himself to kill or poison mortals. Or, another much more morbid interpretation, the Tatarigami and Orobashi are connected. Orobashi's final death was meant to be a lingering form of revenge to Inazuma after being fated to die, and the reason he was so ready to accept his death was because he knew the effects would be devastating to Yashiori Island. This interpretation would definitely clash with our characterization of Orobashi, but nevertheless, it is a theorized reason why the Tatarigami exists. I don't personally like it, but we do need to look at both sides of the coin. But that's it for me today. I love Orobashi's story as a theorist because it has so many layers than just mean snake hates a girl. Orobashi is just a really tragic story, I can appreciate it. Though the reason that his lore is really fascinating from a meta context is that even the author of the book tells us just how difficult decoding Sango no Miya text really is, because it's not an accumulation of factual history, but instead an accumulation of people's consciousness. It also doesn't help that Enkanomiya language was already really difficult to translate in the first place, and the Byakuya chronicles were essentially lost to history, which makes it all the more strange. That's why I like Genshin's lore. Genshin's lore shows that even it's theorizing on its concepts. It's like the ultimate theorizing paradox. Not even the game knows what's going on. Anyway, that's it. My name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me.